It was supposed to be a joke, a dark, cosmic prank played by the universe on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1944. 50 miles off course, through a gap in the clouds no wider than a city block, American bombardiers peered down at a town they swore was a German chemical weapons hub. They saw a river cutting through the landscape, winding its way through the valley like a silver snake. They saw a rail yard at the edge of town, its tracks glinting in the rare sunlight. They saw what they desperately needed to see. At 10:58 in the morning, the lead navigator gave the signal. 60 tons of high explosives whistled through the freezing air, tumbling end over end toward the unsuspecting ground below. The sound was a terrifying crescendo, a mechanical scream that pierced the quiet of the morning. But as the smoke cleared and the reports began drifting back across the channel to England, they weren't about a destroyed Nazi factory or a crippled war machine. They were about something far worse. A neutral city in Switzerland. The United States Air Force hadn't just missed a target. They had bombed their own allies' front porch. History is full of these forgotten lessons, moments where the line between victory and disaster wasn't drawn by enemy fire, but by a single cascading human mistake. It is in these cracks of history that we find the most profound truths about warfare and human nature. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the archives, join us by subscribing. We're building a team to uncover the stories the textbooks left out, the uncomfortable truths that hide in the footnotes. Now look at this map. Imagine you're sitting in that cockpit, freezing at 20,000 feet above a continent at war. The metal skin of the aircraft is thin, offering no protection against the biting cold or the terror of anti-aircraft fire. Your hands are numb inside your thick gloves. Your breath forms clouds in the unpressurized cabin. You're staring at a patch of ground through a tiny break in the clouds that looks exactly like your target. The pressure is immense. The lives of your crew, the success of the mission, the very outcome of the war feels like it rests on your shoulders. Would you have dropped the bomb? To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we have to go back to the briefing room at an air base in England. It's early morning on April 1st, 1944. The coffee is stale, bitter, and cold, sitting in tin cups that leave a metallic taste in your mouth. The air is thick with cigarette smoke that hangs in blue layers under bare light bulbs, stinging the eyes. But the confidence? The confidence is sky high. The 8th Air Force wasn't a ragtag group of amateurs fumbling their way through the war. They were the mighty 8th, the tip of the spear, the most advanced and lethal bombing force the world had ever seen. They were the masters of daylight precision bombing, a doctrine that promised to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war without leveling entire cities. The plan for this particular Saturday was aggressive but followed standard doctrine, a massive daylight strike on Ludwigshafen, a German industrial giant on a Rhine river that was churning out poison gas and ammonia for the Nazi war machine. On paper, it was a textbook mission. They had 300 bombers ready to go, their aluminum skins polished and gleaming. They had to payload thousands of pounds of high explosives and incendiaries designed to shatter concrete and ignite chemical fires. And crucially, they had the new H-2X radar system, affectionately nicknamed the Mickey Set, a technological marvel that could see through clouds and paint a picture of the ground below. It was supposed to make getting lost impossible. The commanders didn't just think this plan was perfect. They thought it was foolproof. But there's a funny thing about foolproof plans. They usually underestimate the fools. Or more accurately, they underestimate the universe's ability to conspire against even the best intentions. They underestimate the chaos of reality. The mission brief was deceptively simple. Fly southeast over the Channel, cross into occupied France, navigate to the Rhine Valley, locate the massive chemical works at Ludwigshafen, destroy the production lines, and cripple the enemy's ability to wage chemical warfare. It was the kind of mission that looked clean and elegant on a two-dimensional map spread across a warm briefing room table. The red yarn pinning the route looked straight and logical. But war doesn't happen on paper. It happens in the chaotic, freezing, three-dimensional hell of the upper atmosphere, where the margin for error is measured in seconds and miles. The first crack in the plan wasn't a human error. It was an act of nature, indifferent and powerful. As a massive formation of B-24 liberators climbed over the English Channel, laden with fuel and bombs, Struggling for altitude, they hit a weather front that wasn't in the forecast. The meteorologists back at base, working with limited data from resistance fighters and weather ships, had predicted manageable winds, light cloud cover, and good visibility over the target. They were catastrophically wrong. Up at 20,000 feet, where the air is so thin you can barely breathe without an oxygen mask, a jet stream was tearing across the continent from the northwest. It wasn't just a breeze that gently nudges you off course. It was a howling gale, blowing at nearly 100 miles per hour. This invisible river of air grabbed the heavy bombers like toys and began to shove them sideways, pushing them mile by mile, minute by minute, deeper and deeper into the wrong territory. It was a silent hijacker, altering their destiny without them even knowing it. And here is where the tragedy begins to compound, where one small error becomes a chain reaction. In 1944, you couldn't just glance down at a GPS screen to correct your course. You couldn't pull up a satellite image on a tablet. You relied on dead reckoning, a method of navigation that is exactly as ominous as it sounds. It involves calculating your position based on three simple factors: speed, time, and heading. You measure how fast you're flying through the air, you note how long you've been flying, and you plot your heading on a magnetic compass. Simple math gives you your position, but there's a fatal flaw in the system. Dead reckoning requires you to know the wind. If your speed is being boosted by a tailwind you don't know exists, and your heading is being skewed by a crosswind, you can't feel inside the pressurized cabin. Your math becomes a beautiful, elegant fiction. You are solving an equation with the wrong variables. Every calculation compounds the error. Every minute takes you further from where you think you are. But the Americans had an ace up their sleeve. Or so they thought. They had the Mickey, the H-2X ground scanning radar. It was a cutting edge of military technology, a device that could pierce through solid cloud cover and paint a glowing green picture of the ground below. Rivers showed up as dark lines where the radar waves were absorbed. Cities appeared as bright clusters where the waves bounced off buildings. It was their insurance policy against getting lost, their technological safety net. Except on the lead plane of the formation, carrying the lead navigator who was responsible for guiding dozens of aircraft behind him, the Mickey set didn't work. It failed almost immediately after takeoff. Perhaps it was a faulty vacuum tube that burned out in the bitter cold. Perhaps it was a loose connection rattled apart by the violent vibration of the engines. The cause doesn't really matter. What matters is that the one tool that could have pierced the cloud cover and revealed their true location was nothing more than dead weight. The lead navigator, a man named Captain Charles H. Koch, carrying the responsibility for dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives on his shoulders, was now flying blind. He was staring at a white sheet of clouds below him, relying entirely on calculations that were being systematically shredded by winds he couldn't see or feel. Imagine the tension building in that cockpit. The navigator knows he should be over Germany by now. He checks his watch obsessively, tapping the glass face. He checks his map, tracing the plotted course with gloved finger, measuring distances with a pair of dividers. He does the mental math again and again, sweating despite the freezing temperatures. According to his calculations, based on their departure time and their airspeed, they should be approaching Ludwigshafen. The timeline matches. The heading seems right. Everything checks out on paper. But the ground speed of the formation has been nearly doubled by that ferocious tailwind. They aren't just slightly off course. They are racing ahead of schedule, hurtling south faster than anyone realizes. The invisible hand of the jet stream has pushed them far beyond their intended target. They are moving across the map at speeds they shouldn't be capable of reaching. They weren't over the industrial heartland of Germany. They had already blown past it miles ago. They were now drifting over the pristine forest of the Black Forest, crossing an invisible line on the map into neutral airspace. They were over Switzerland, and they had no idea. The clouds below them were a blank canvas upon which they projected their expectations. The formation had become a confused herd, without the lead radar functioning. The other planes were forced to simply follow the leader. This was standard procedure. Follow the leader, drop on his signal. If he turned, they turned. If he climbed, they climbed. If he dropped his bombs, they would drop theirs. Radio silence was strictly enforced to avoid alerting German night fighters lurking the clouds. So there was no chatter, no second-guessing, no casual, "Hey, does that river look right to you?" radio between planes. Just a deafening roar for engines on each aircraft and the silent, creeping dread that something fundamental was wrong. A collective anxiety began to settle over crews, an unspoken feeling that the world outside their windows didn't match the world on their maps. Then, nature played its cruelest trick. A gap opened in the clouds. For a brief, terrible moment, the clouds broke apart. Through the ragged opening, the lead bombardier saw a city spread out below him like a model on a table. The sun caught the red tile roofs. He saw the glint of water. He saw a river bending to the south. Ludwigshafen has a river, the mighty Rhine. He saw a railway yard on the edge of town, with tracks splaying out like veins. Ludwigshafen has a railway yard, a critical transport hub. He saw a cluster of industrial buildings with smokestacks. Ludwigshafen is a factory town, the home of IG Farben. It was a textbook case of confirmation bias, the kind that psychologists would study for decades afterward. The brain sees what it expects to see, especially under stress, especially when you're desperate for validation. The bombardier didn't look for the landmarks that weren't there, the massive chemical storage tanks, the specific layout of the Rhine docks, the distinctive pattern of the factory complex. He looked for the similarities. And in that terrible moment, he found them. He filtered out the contradictions and focused on the confirmations. This is a tragic irony of the map reader's dilemma. From 4 miles up, through a small break in the clouds, with adrenaline pumping and the knowledge that German fighters could appear at any second, the Rhine River looks like the Rhine River. A cluster of red-roof European buildings looks like any other cluster of red-roof European buildings. Schaffhausen, nestled innocently on the north bank of the Rhine, geographically mimicked the target city just enough to fool a desperate crew looking for a reason, any reason, to complete their mission and go home. But there were warnings. Quiet, desperate warnings that were never spoken aloud. Some navigators in the rear of the formation were uneasy. Their own dead reckoning calculations didn't quite add up. The sun angle felt subtly wrong. It was too high in the sky for their supposed latitude. The flight time felt just a bit too long. But military discipline is a powerful silencer. You don't break radio silence to argue with the lead plane unless you are absolutely certain. And nobody was certain. They were just worried, with a gnawing sense of unease they couldn't articulate. They trusted the lead navigator more than they trusted their own gut feelings. On the ground, far below the circling bombers, the tragedy was compounding in a completely different way. The air raid sirens in Schaffhausen began to wail their familiar warbling cry. But this wasn't the first time. The Swiss border towns were used to Allied planes buzzing through their airspace. They were used to the distant rumble of war happening just beyond their borders. The sirens had become almost routine, a background noise to daily life. To the people in the streets, the sirens were more of a nuisance than a genuine warning. A young boy looked up from his market errand and pointed excitedly at the silver specks glittering in the morning sun. A shopkeeper, annoyed at the interruption, flipped the open sign on his door and continued arranging his display. There was no panic. Why would there be? They were neutral. They were protected by international law. They were safe. The red cross on their flag was supposed to be a shield. And then there was the date. It was April 1st, April Fool's Day. As the sirens whined through the cobblestone streets, many residents actually thought it might be a test, or perhaps a dark joke played by the civil defense authorities. They didn't run to the shelters carved into the hillsides. They stood in the streets. They went to their windows to watch the spectacle. Some waved at the planes, a gesture of neutral friendliness. They saw the bombers not as harbingers of doom, but as passing curiosities. Back in the sky, the lead bombardier made his final adjustment. The crosshairs in his northern bomb sight drifted smoothly over what he believed was the city center of Ludwigshafen. He wasn't looking at a neutral town full of civilians who thought they were safe. In his mind, in his calculations, in his desperate need to complete the mission, he was looking at a Nazi chemical plant that needed to be erased from existence. He was doing his job. The disconnect was total and absolute. The generals had a clean plan on a two-dimensional map. The pilots had a view through the clouds that confirmed their worst assumptions. And the people on the ground had a false sense of security built on 5 years of successful neutrality. 3 different realities, all about to collide in a single devastating moment. The lead plane's bomb bay doors groaned open with a hydraulic whine. The others in formation immediately followed suit, opening their own bellies to the sky. 1,000 dark shapes tumbled out of the silver undersides of the Liberators, catching the sunlight as they fell, spiraling down through the cold morning air. The quiet warnings were over. The time for second-guessing was gone. Gravity had taken over. The bombs were no longer political instruments. They were physics in motion. At 10:58 in the morning, the illusion shattered like glass. The low hum that had been vibrating the window panes of Schaffhausen suddenly roared into a deafening crescendo that drowned out every other sound. The residents who had been standing in the streets, pointing curiously at the sky, barely had time to register the change in pitch. The whistle of a falling bomb is a sound that bypasses conscious thought and goes straight to pure animal instinct. It is a sound of incoming death, a rising shriek that turns your blood to ice. First came the incendiaries. They clattered onto rooftops like deadly hail, punching through clay tiles and thudding into attics. Within seconds, they ignited the dry timber of centuries-old roof beams. Then came the high explosives. The world turned white. The ground heaved as if it had turned liquid. 60 tons of explosives slammed into the city center in a span of less than 40 seconds. The railway station, the innocent landmark that had convinced the Americans they were over a German industrial hub, simply disintegrated. The walls blew outward. The roof collapsed. The platforms vanished in a cloud of pulverized concrete. The nearby Natural History Museum, a beautiful building that housed centuries of collected knowledge and irreplaceable artifacts, collapsed into a heap of rubble and swirling dust. Paintings that had survived wars and revolutions were consumed by fire in seconds. Statues were decapitated by shrapnel. In the span of less than 1 minute, a peaceful, neutral Saturday morning was transformed into a jagged hellscape of fire and ruin. Entire city blocks ceased to exist. Buildings that had stood for 400 years vanished. The market square became a crater. The sound was indescribable, a mix of crumbling masonry, roaring fire, and human screams. Up in the air, oblivious to catastrophe unfolding below, the mood was triumphant. Bombs away, target destroyed, the radio operator noted carefully in his mission log. To the crews banking away from the smoke, the plumes of black rising from the valley were proof of a job well done. They had hit the chemical works. They had crippled a piece of the Nazi war machine. They turned their aircraft around, satisfied and relieved, and began the long flight back across the channel to England, hot coffee and debriefing. They had absolutely no idea they had just killed 40 civilians in a country that wasn't even in the war. As the bombers droned westward toward home, the telephone lines connecting Bern and London began to light up like a switchboard on fire. The Swiss government was frantic, messages flying between ministries. They weren't just angry. They were terrified. Had the Allies declared war without warning? Was this the opening move of an invasion? Had Switzerland's careful 5-year balancing act finally collapsed? The fear of invasion, always present in the Swiss psyche, suddenly became immediate and real. The message was relayed up the chain of command with agonizing slowness. It moved from panicked Swiss border guards to stern diplomats, from the diplomats to the British Foreign Office, and finally, with the weight of an anvil, to the 8th Air Force headquarters. When the bombers landed back at their base at 14:45 in the afternoon, the crews were exhausted but happy. They climbed stiffly out of their planes, expecting cold beers and congratulatory pats on the back from their ground crews. Instead, they were met with stone-faced military police and officers who wouldn't meet their eyes. The group commander spent the entire night on the telephone, his voice growing quieter and more strained with every call. He pulled the navigation logs from the lead plane. He pulled the bombardier's target identification reports. He laid them all out on his desk next to a detailed map of Central Europe, and he began to trace the flight path. The tragic irony was staring him in the face, undeniable and damning. The timestamps matched perfectly. The bomb release time coincided exactly to the minute with the first explosions reported in Schaffhausen. The forested area, the Navigator claimed to have used as a landmark was the Black Forest, 60 miles from the intended target. Captain Koch was called into the office. He stood there at attention, still wearing his flight jacket, still smelling of high-altitude coal and engine oil, as the reality of his perfect calculations crumbled around him. The wind had pushed them 120 miles off course. The radar that should have saved them had failed. The visual confirmation he'd relied on was a complete mirage. They hadn't bombed Ludwigshafen. They hadn't even bombed Germany. They had bombed Switzerland. Back in the burning city, Swiss emergency crews were pulling bodies from the wreckage. 40 people dead, 270 injured, many critically, 400 suddenly homeless, their houses reduced to smoking ruins. The United States of America had just committed an act of war against its own friend, and all because a gust of wind blew a little too hard. A vacuum tube burned out at exactly the wrong moment, and a man looked at a river and saw exactly what he desperately needed to see. The joke of April 1st was over, and nobody anywhere was laughing. The silence after the bombs was louder than the explosions themselves. Where the Grand Railway Station had stood that morning, there was now a crater filled with twisted metal and splintered timber. Where the Natural History Museum had displayed centuries of carefully collected knowledge, there was ash, rubble, and the acrid smell of burning history. 40 bodies were pulled from the wreckage over the following hours. 270 wounded were carried to hospitals that were suddenly, desperately overwhelmed. 400 residents had no homes to return to. For a neutral country that spent 5 agonizing years carefully navigating the razor's edge of European politics, playing diplomacy with both the Allies and the Axis, the attack was a seismic shock that threatened everything. Switzerland wasn't just angry. It was existentially terrified. Had this been a warning shot across the bow? A punishment for selling precision ball bearings to Germany? A prelude to full-scale invasion? The phones in the American embassy in Bern rang off the hook for days. Swiss Foreign Minister Max Petitpierre demanded answers, explanations, assurances that this wouldn't happen again. The newspapers, still restrained by wartime censorship, printed carefully worded reports that danced around the full truth. But the people knew. Everyone in Switzerland knew. The Americans had bombed them. Within days, the massive diplomatic machinery lurched into emergency action. General Karl Spaatz, the stern-faced commander of the entire 8th Air Force, was personally dispatched to Switzerland to deliver a formal apology in person. According to everyone who witnessed it, he hated every single second. This was a man who had orchestrated the strategic firebombing of entire German cities, who had sent thousands of planes into the teeth of Nazi flak defenses without flinching, and now he was standing in a neutral country's capital, hat literally in hand, apologizing for a mistake that should never have happened. The United States government promised swift and substantial reparations. By October 1944, just 6 months after the bombing, they had already delivered $4 million in immediate relief to Switzerland. By 1949, when the final account was complete, the total tally reached over 62 million Swiss francs, an absolutely astronomical sum in post-war currency. The money rebuilt homes, restored the museum's collections, and compensated the families of the dead. But it couldn't restore the one thing that had been irreparably shattered: trust. Back in England, the grinding wheels of military justice began to turn. Captain Charles H. Koch, the lead navigator whose calculations had gone so catastrophically wrong, was formally rebuked and stripped of his position. He would never fly as a lead navigator again. His flying career was effectively over, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The bombardier who had released the bombs was quietly reassigned to a different unit, his name scrubbed from the official reports. The entire mission was erased from the records of successful operations, buried in a classified file that wouldn't see daylight for decades. But here's the tragic irony that nobody in command wanted to acknowledge or admit. Captain Koch had followed every single rule. He had done the mathematics correctly. He had used every tool he was given. He had followed standard operating procedures to the letter. And when those tools catastrophically failed him, when the weather conspired against every calculation, when the clouds parted at precisely the wrong moment to show him a city that looked close enough to his target, he made a decision based on the absolute best information he had available. So the question becomes inescapable. Was this really his fault? Or was it the fault of a command structure that routinely sent men into war zones with faulty equipment and optimistic weather forecasts? Was it the fault of a system that prioritized speed and aggressive action over caution and triple-checking verification? Was it the fault of a doctrine that said close enough was acceptable when you're dropping explosives from 4 miles up? Switzerland rebuilt because that's what resilient nations do. The city of Schaffhausen became an unlikely symbol of neutral suffering and determination. In an extraordinary wave of national solidarity that swept across the country, municipalities and private citizens from Geneva to Zurich donated art, money, and cultural artifacts to replace what had been lost when the museum burned. Over 80 irreplaceable paintings were destroyed in the fire. Within 2 years, dozens of new works have been donated to fill the empty walls, a collective effort to heal a wound that couldn't be measured in francs alone. The Swiss government quietly accepted the official American explanation. It was a tragic mistake. Radar failure. Unprecedented high winds. Misidentification under combat stress. An accident, not an act of aggression. But behind the closed doors of Swiss military planning rooms, harder questions were being asked. If the Americans, with their advanced technology and meticulous planning, could accidentally bomb a Swiss city in broad daylight, what else could they do by mistake? What other horrors might rain down from a clear blue sky because someone misread a map? The incident hardened Switzerland's commitment to armed neutrality in ways that persist to this day. They would never again rely solely on the goodwill or competence of superpowers. Every Swiss bridge would be wired for demolition. Every mountain pass would hide artillery. Every able-bodied citizen would train for war, not because they want to fight, but because April 1st, 1944, taught them that accidents can be just as deadly as invasions. Today, if you walk through the reconstructed streets of Schaffhausen, you can still find traces of that terrible morning. Small bronze plaques mark where buildings once stood before they were vaporized. The museum, beautifully rebuilt, maintains a modest exhibit dedicated to the tragedy, with photographs of the devastation and artifacts recovered from the ruins. But for the most part, the city has moved on. Life has returned. The scars have faded into history. Yet the deeper lesson remains unhealed, unlearned, waiting to be repeated. The bombing of Schaffhausen wasn't the result of malice or criminal incompetence. It was a result of a system that moved too fast, trusted technology too completely, and forgot the fundamental truth that war is always fought by fallible human beings who make human mistakes under inhuman pressure. The cost of that forgetfulness, the cost of ego, of certainty, of the refusal to question or double-check or admit uncertainty, was measured in 40 lives. 40 individual human beings who woke up on a Saturday morning, made breakfast, went to market, and never came home. They were killed by friendly fire from a country that didn't even know they existed, erased by bombs dropped with absolute confidence by men who believed they were doing the right thing. History doesn't repeat itself, the saying goes, but it certainly rhymes. And the rhythm of overconfidence, technological failure, and cascading human error plays on an endless loop across the centuries. From Schaffhausen to modern drone strikes in Yemen, from friendly fire incidents in Iraq to misidentified wedding parties in Afghanistan, the same tragedy, wearing different uniforms, flying different aircraft, guided by different technology, but always ending the same way. We tell these stories not to mock the dead or shame the survivors or point fingers at men who did their best under impossible circumstances. We tell them because forgetting is the only truly unforgivable mistake. If you want to join us as we continue to uncover these hidden chapters of history, the moments that textbooks skip over, the lessons that commanders never quite learned, the warnings that went unheeded, then subscribe to this channel. Because the past isn't just a collection of interesting stories to pass the time. It's a warning written in blood and rubble. And we ignore those warnings at our absolute peril.